All right, well, you know what happens every year. I remember when I was in college, preached for the small country church. For the last couple of years I was in college, and our piano player was a young lady from Idaho. And most of the time we commuted together, but not always. And on Time Change Sunday, she's like, I'm going to drive. And needless to say, it was the other one, and she went to church and sat there for an hour and nobody showed up, so she left and I met her on the highway. And
yeah, see now, they leave us the crayon. It's been there 2 Sundays now, the crayon. You take notes with crayons.
Who does?
I don't know, Don asked you if you do because it's right in front of you.
Oh golly, I got caught.
Yeah.
Coloring during the sermons.
There you go.
I like the color between the lines.
Yeah.
all right, well, we will go ahead and get started here. Gonna have to pull my phone out to give us a clock, since the clock in here needs a new battery. It's not completely dead because when I got here this morning it said 4:25. And just to let you guys know, of course, coming up here in a couple of weeks, Easter will be here. Yeah, I know, it's crazy. But Easter's early this year, so it's not like time is just flying for flying's sake, but it is definitely coming. Of course, we won't be having Sunday school on Easter Sunday. We will be having breakfast at 8:30 down in the gym. But we will get this lesson started, and we'll see if we get through it before Easter. We may or may not. Praying to be seen or heard. This is lesson number 11 of our parables, the parable of the Pharisee and the Publican. Or you could ask, how is your prayer life? The text, Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. And here's the text. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but everyone who humbles himself will be exalted. Thoughts? Comments? Initial observations, perhaps? Anybody? Okay. Dealing with the context and the content of the parable. This parable was spoken after Jesus had given the parable of the persistent widow. The circumstances and the purposes of the parable are therefore somewhat similar to the ones that we previously covered. They are separate stories, but they were told pretty much in the same setting. The previous parable involved a persistent widow, showed among other things that we need to persist in our prayer life to God. He always listens and He always answers our prayers. They're not always in the way that we want them answered, nor necessarily on the timetable. We might consider this question: are we always always ready to receive God's answer to our prayer? Or would we sometimes find God's answer very inconvenient to our life plan? Reminds me of a statement Dietrich Bonhoeffer made, and it's one I try to remind myself of. When things do not necessarily go my way, we have to be prepared to be interrupted by God. Because sometimes He steps in when we don't expect Him to. We could be praying for something, and when He answers our prayer, He answers it in such a way that it's like, I wanted an answer, but that wasn't what I was looking for. Or that wasn't the timing that I was looking for. In this parable, Jesus is more interested in teaching us the attitude we should have towards God as we pray. We shall notice two individuals and their radically different attitudes, clearly illustrated by Jesus. Anybody?
I'm going to go up to the top. What's the text?
Okay.
No. I'm just really blown away by who trusted in themselves that they were righteous.
Uh-huh.
Why in the world would they think that they were righteous?
Because 2,000 years of Jewish history had made them arrogant.
But that doesn't mean that they were righteous.
Well, no, they confused the two. What they had, they thought was righteousness, but what they really possessed was arrogance.
They had been chosen.
Well, yeah, and see, that was what got them in trouble. When God planted Israel there in the Promised Land, what we call the Shephelah, the King's Highway area, lowlands of Israel, He stuck them there with a purpose. You're supposed to be a light to the nations. But they took the position of my least favorite prophet, Jonah, and they were jerks about it. They kind of went for a while and hid out in the hills, and then they took their privileged status of we are God's chosen people. Not that we are God's chosen people for a purpose. They stopped at we are God's chosen people and to the blazes with the rest of it. That's why Jonah basically laments the fact that Nineveh repented. And so they have this idea that, and it's been inbred in them for years, that we're God's chosen people, therefore we're better than anybody else. And there's a second side to this, because you have what I would liken to a caste system. Prevalent still in some Asian countries. India still has it to a very high degree. If you are of a different social class, you're considered less. And so here you have a Pharisee. So this guy's top of the heap. This guy doesn't say, but I would imagine this guy's probably part of the Sanhedrin. He's probably part of the Jewish council. And the other guy is a tax collector for Rome. Eek. You know, this guy's dirt personified. I mean, you make part of your living by cheating other people. You know,
But it doesn't say that he was cheating other people.
No, and I don't think he was. By this, I don't think, but I think that was the common perception, because that's what they...
But it also doesn't say that he was Jewish either. To be in the temple.
Well,
He wouldn't be in the temple.
he could be in the outer part.
Yeah, that's true.
And so, if he's a Gentile, I've never seen anybody draw that conclusion, but it could very well be. Or you could have a situation where, well, look at the eunuch. The eunuch couldn't go any further than the court of the Gentiles because he was a eunuch. I mean, you have the court of the Gentiles, the court of women, the court of men, and then the temple proper. Now, one thing we also got to realize on this is that those three courts are nowhere in the Old Testament. Those were an advent of Third Temple, Herod taking a line out of pagan religions. if he's there to pray, it doesn't say where they were at. You go up to the temple to pray. You could have been in Solomon's colonnade, which runs around the outside of it, which is where the early church met, or just as close as you could get.
What I was thinking of is, the Pharisees, you can't do anything wrong if you don't do anything.
Yes.
If you stand around and look at everyone else, you're not doing anything wrong because you're not doing anything. So you're not going to fail.
Yeah. But they miss the issue of not doing something is as big as an issue of doing something you're not supposed to.
Yes.
It's the omission issue.
Yes.
But they don't operate under that assumption. But no, I have no idea where this guy was praying in. He could have been a Jew, he could have been a Gentile, but I think regardless of who you are, and if I understand my Roman history right, the Roman tax collectors that were collecting taxes on the Romans were just as big of a group of shysters as the other ones were. I mean, nobody likes to pay taxes. I mean, heck, tax season's coming up. I'm going through my yearly, collating my receipts and getting ready to send my stuff off to my CPA who's done my taxes for the last 20 years. Bless the lady, she's gifted at ministry taxes. But I keep every receipt and I scribble on it what it's for, because man, if I can take that as a tax deduction, if I can give old Uncle Sam as less of my money as possible, I'm going to do it. And we don't like tax collectors. I always feel sorry. In some ways, I feel sorry for those guys who happen to work for the IRS that are just trying to do their jobs.
I was a little surprised that he would, even in the outer edges, that he would be allowed there because he was a tax collector.
Yeah.
Because they hated him so much.
Yeah.
That was a little bit of a surprise.
Well, maybe some of you haven't seen The Chosen, but the way the disciples treat Matthew, because he's a,
Tax collector.
Those 12 people,
Oh yeah.
they were Pharisees.
No, I'm sure on that one, and I haven't seen that episode, but I'm sure on that one, it is that way of, why in the heck did you pick him? It's like, of all other people, of all the people available, why did you pick a tax collector? Yeah, no, I get it. I imagine it was somewhat similar when you get down to Simon and Judas. Because they're basically no more than domestic terrorists. That it's like, oh, I'm going to pick these guys. Now we'll talk about that because we actually have a sermon series coming up where we're going to go through the lives of all of the disciples of Jesus. And so, but no, it's an interesting context because there are things that we know and things that we don't know. And I think in part that's good because it makes us ask the question, it could be anybody. So let's put ourselves in this. I've said from the get-go when we look at the parables, you're going to see yourself in here somewhere. It's just like any teachings of Jesus. In some way, shape, or form, you're going to see yourself in this text. I mean, when it comes to the Pharisee and the Publican, which one are you? And I think it can go either way. And I'm not even talking about consistently either way. It could go either way depending on the context. Because how many times do we sit up in our lives and look down at somebody else because they're less spiritual than we are? Or they don't have it together, and they should in our own minds. And the list just kind of goes on and on and on. I think one of the things that the church and even the modern church deals with is we have a superiority issue. That we think we're better than everybody else. Yeah, we may be blessed and we may have a relationship with Christ, which is necessary. But that doesn't give us the right to look down on somebody else that doesn't. In fact, that should drive us to compassion. Or just because we do something one way and somebody else does it another, or, the list just kind of goes on and on and on that. There are two main characters in the story. The Pharisee and the tax collector, or who the text calls the Publican. Each represents two well-known groups of people in Jesus' day. In order to understand the force of Jesus' message, we need to note some of the religious, social, and political conditions at play here. So they are at play. A Pharisee, look at the Apostle Paul. I'm the Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and it just kind of goes on down the line. These are the rule keepers. So the first character we're introduced, the Pharisee. As we'll recall from previous lessons, all over the course of history, the Jewish nation developed a number of sects based on theological and socio-political positions on a number of issues. While there were many of these groups, there were 5 of them that were dominant. So you have the Pharisees, basically what we would call the legalists. The Sadducees, we call these guys the liberals. They don't believe in the afterlife. They don't believe in a resurrection. They don't believe in angels or spirits or anything like that. You have the Essenes. I like to call the Essenes the weird uncle. We all have that weird uncle or some family member that just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. The one that's driven by conspiracy theories. And
I have a question here too. I'm going to go back to the Pharisees and Sadducees.
okay.
How in the world, how did they actually get divided into those two groups? Down through the years, they all started out as one group.
Yeah.
And then how did they split? And some became Pharisees and some became Sadducees.
It's I don't know. I would almost, the question that was asked was, how did the Pharisees and Sadducees become two different groups? I would say, I would liken it to a slow burn. They didn't start out that way.
Right.
But I think it's just over the years and over the generations, things just diverge. Until you get to the point that, okay, these are two separate groups. I don't think it was one day that all of a sudden, well, I disagree with you, so I'm going to take my toys and leave the sandbox. I don't think it's one of those issues. I think it's a slow process as time goes, and I think it deals with all of these. The Essenes, the Herodians, the Zealots. It's just, people love to separate themselves into groups. That's a given. We like to find things, unfortunately, to focus things on things that separate us, not on the things that that bring us together. Now, the Jewish council had both. There was still enough unity in those groups that you're there in the Sanhedrin, you have Pharisees and you have Sadducees. You see that because, well, the Apostle Paul, in an effort to kind of get out of a sticky situation, what does he say? I'm here because I believe in the resurrection of the dead, and all of a sudden the Pharisees who hate this guy come to his defense. Because I dislike the Sadducees more than I dislike this guy. It becomes very problematic. And the Sadducees, at the time of Jesus and the apostles and Paul, the Sadducees control the temple. They are the priest, high priest, and a bunch of the, not necessarily all of them, but the auxiliary priests, they come out of the party of the Sadducees. It's kind of like political parties. In this day and age, politics and religion are the same side of the same coin. So how do they get there? Don't know. I can't give you a definitive date. You can go back and you can read the history books and look at the history of the sects. And they form at relatively the same time. And you just see this slow divergence. And then you have some splitter groups as you get down there. The Essenes, their community lasts for maybe 100 years. And when I say that they're the weird uncles, the conspiracy theorists, they're the ones that are like, they make the Pharisees look like liberals. We're going to take these passages of Scripture and we're going to hyper-focus on them. Now, one benefit of them doing that is we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because they went off and became hermits in the desert, lived a very austere and ascetic life. And one of the reasons why they only lasted about 100 years, because they were all guys. If you were a lady, you could not be in a scene. They viewed any sort of intimate relationship as inherently sinful, so the best way to avoid that is to boot the ladies. And so, if you're a group of all guys, well, you're not propagating your numbers. You're eventually going to die out. And they were on their way out by the time 70 AD rolls around and the Romans destroy the temple. Well, the Romans kind of come in and wipe them out en masse too. The Herodians, Jews that are associated with the house of Herod, that's a small group, and that's just kind of an offshoot. What we would call Hellenized Jews. The Hellenistic world, the Greek world, the Roman world. So you have Jews, a lot of people don't realize this, you have Jews in Israel in the first century that if you were to look at them from the outside, you could not tell they were Jewish. Because they dressed like Romans, they talked like Romans, they acted like Romans. The only thing that separated them was when they would show up in the synagogue. And all of a sudden, they have, I'm trying to remember the tefillin, whatever, the bands around their arms and around their head when they go to pray. Oh, wait a minute. They are Jews. They got the prayer shawls on, but Monday through Friday they look like Romans. And they act like Romans. Hope that answers your question on that. There's a lot to it. I mean, literal sets of books have been written on the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That's just a, 35,000 feet view of it.
Is it true, I guess maybe not for the Essenes, but for the rest of them, is it true once the separation happened, or they separated into groups, were you kind of born into that?
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. Well, that's why Paul points out. I mean, he makes no bones about it. I'm a Pharisee, and I'm the son of a Pharisee. And chances are, he doesn't go that far back. He may have even been a grandson, great-grandson of a Pharisee. It's kind of that badge of honor of, I'm generational. I mean, you could join the party of the Pharisees. I mean, you have to meet certain criteria. In fact, and this goes back, and we'd have to dig deep into it, but the question arises, when Paul becomes a Christian and he stops being a Pharisee, what does that do to him as far as his standing is concerned? Because he's a generational Pharisee. He's a leader. Now, it doesn't say, we don't ever read in Scripture that Paul is there in Jerusalem when the things that happened with Jesus take place. And I think had he been there, we would have known about it. But we know he shows up in Jerusalem rather quickly after Jesus, because he's there with Stephen and so on and so forth. But you see him in his ministry looking back and pulling little snippets out of his life, his Pharisaical world. I think him leaving the party of the Pharisees was like switching religions for him. I don't think it was something that came easily. And I think there are times that when you read his letters, you can tell he used to be a Pharisee. Now there's even a question about whether Paul was ever married. And one of the explanations that I've heard to it, it's one that I see as not only a possibility but a probability, was that when he became a Christian, he lost his family. That he lost his wife. Because Pharisees were all married. History tells us that. Yet Paul doesn't have a wife. And he doesn't speak of it, really. And so the thought is like, you know. And this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but what it was, I wonder if he was married to the daughter of the high priest or something. You know, if it was something like that where you have a, you know, this is a huge, huge change. Well, early Christianity was just considered another sect of Judaism. If you were a Jew in the first century, say around 35 to 45 AD, the first 10 years after the resurrection, they would just simply put Christian, hereafter zealot, because the church is predominantly Jewish. In fact, when Pilate writes to Caesar about it, we have this in the historical record, when Pilate writes to Caesar, that's what Christians are described as just another sect of Judaism, because they share a common history. But it's so much more than that. So, interconnected, yes. Different, oh yeah. And there were other lesser groups that you don't read much about. But just like anybody, we love to divide ourselves, and it's sad. Well, look at the church. At last count, 530 plus different denominations in the U.S. 530 plus. I look at that and I just shake my head. It's like, really? But we like to divide ourselves.
Marie and Jamie lived in Tuttle, Oklahoma. I was there at the Christian church, but I believe I counted at least 4 different kinds of Baptist church, and they all broke off from the original Baptist.
Yeah.
For various reasons.
Yep.
Over whatever.
Yep.
But yeah, the town was full of Baptists. They weren't all Baptist church.
Well, yeah, there are bigger groups, so you tend to see it more, but our church is no different. You have the Disciples of Christ, you have the Church of Christ, you have the Christian Connection, you have various other little, every church has done it. And our movement started as a unity movement, but it barely lasted past the first generation. Why? Because people struggle to play nice together. Huh? Well, they are, and in fact, this parable shows a lot about the human existence and how we look at each other, because we do this not only in religious terms, we do it in cultural terms. That person's from the wrong side of the tracks. Well, last week we were talking about Chuck Sackett. You know, the son of a bartender. You know, I came from the wrong, the first one to admit, I came from the wrong side of the tracks. Yeah? But what exactly does that mean? It just means that you didn't have the same upbringing as the person on the other side of the tracks that may have looked like they had more, but they had issues just like you did. Anybody else? Zealots?
Now, Simon was a zealot, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
And they adhered more to, they were trying to, weren't they trying to overthrow the Roman government?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, the Zealots were a group. They weren't necessarily a theological party like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. I know there's a religious aspect there, but their existence was primarily, we're there to overthrow Rome. We're there to get the invader out. They take as their clarion call, if you will, the scriptural admonition to not let a foreigner rule over you. And so that's their party platform. Kill the Romans. Then you take it one step further, and you have a group known as the Sicarii. They're even more intense in their hatred for Rome. They're even more intense on their desire to see the Jewish kingdom reestablished. And I think a very good case, it's not perfect, but I think a very good case has been made that Judas is part of this group. And I think it drives some of his actions specifically related to Jesus.
You can see
Yeah.
Jesus was going to be different.
Yeah.
And so,
And Jesus was different, but his time scale is off. You know.
not his mode of action or whatever, he wasn't going to go after them with swords and knives. It was
Yeah. Yep.
a different scenario.
Yeah. I tend to take the position that Judas, what he did was wrong, what he did was evil, but it was the ends justify the means. And
God used him for that purpose.
he did, because Judas could have walked away. Anybody could have walked away. It's this whole idea that it's God's plan, you know. God predestines the plan, not necessarily the man. Somebody else would have betrayed Jesus. Somebody else would have got Jesus into the hands of those that were going to kill him. And also at the end, Judas, just like Peter, could have been restored. But he was so broken over what he had done that he, goes out and unalives himself. But, you see the grief. You see the guilt. I'm guilty of innocent blood. Because he realizes rather quickly that he's been used. And what he wants to have happen didn't happen. And it's this almost epiphany of, I messed up.
He's almost an example in a weird kind of way because he did love Jesus, he followed him. But yet at some point he became disenchanted with him.
Yeah.
A Christian hasn't at some point questioned God or
Yeah.
Jesus. He just took it a step farther.
Yeah, it's the slow burn of disbelief. And the difference, we've talked about it in here, the difference between unbelief and disbelief. Unbelief is lack of information. Disbelief is knowing the truth and rejecting it anyway. Because what does Scripture tell us specifically about Judas? One, in the beginning, he was trusted enough that they put him in charge of the money. But as time goes along, he starts to pilfer from the purse. And so it's these little things that push him up, and eventually he becomes disenchanted. Now, I have heard, I don't know how many sermons preached about, well, Judas was never a believer, and Judas was never saved. No. I can't buy that because when Scripture talks about Jesus sending out the 12 and Jesus sending out the 70 and what they were able to do, Judas is counted in that number. And it doesn't say all of these great things were done except for Judas because he's a dirtbag. But
I think he had a true heart to follow Jesus.
oh yeah.
I just think that he led the way of the world.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
important to him.
I will tell you, if I have compassion for any of the followers of Jesus, I think in many ways it has to be Judas. Because it's the story of a broken man. And you just look at it and go, I see myself in that picture.
That's what I mean. I think that he could be an example for many of us that instead of coming back to God as he should have and asked for forgiveness, he took it into his own hands
Yeah.
and did it himself.
Yep. Well, it's that,
He said he could come back.
it is that degree of hopelessness. He goes out and unalives himself. Well, why does anybody in our culture do that? Because you reach that degree of hopelessness. I mean, our publican in the story, he looks like a pretty hopeless individual. He's like, I'm a sinner. I'm a dirtbag. I'm the wretch that the song sings about.
Now,
Dear God, thank you, I'm not like this dirtbag.
the other thing I'm curious about too is how did the tax collectors were they approached by the Roman government because they were good at dealing with money and stuff, or were they
Well,
come in and like
Yeah, well, it's one of those things. From what I understand from Jewish history, anytime, well, actually from Roman history, anytime Rome would go in somewhere and conquer the area, your best friends are the locals, because they know the religions, they know the customs, they know the traditions, and so you're going in and you're going to find people to work with you. Now, with the tax collectors, they're disliked in any culture, and so basically what you would have is kind of the lower tier of the caste system, the lower tier of the society, are the ones that are recruited. The Romans are paying money to do a job. And maybe appeals to the more dishonest folk among you, because if you can squeeze a few extra dollars out, that makes you a little bit better off. And so you go in and you sit down, you don't have forms, but you go in and here's your tax, and you gotta, slide me a few more coins here, and those coins go into my pocket.
Because the Romans only wanted what they were taxing. So
Yeah.
if you would skip something off the top, it was yours, right?
Yeah, yep. Well, that's where Zacchaeus comes into play. Anybody I've wronged, I'll not only give restitution, but basically I'll pay interest on that restitution. So he goes in going, him going into the temple to pray, most people look at him and why do you even bother? You're a dirtbag. I look at it, my friend Jason preaches over in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the church is an interesting story, because he was the worship minister there at the church. The church at one time had been a very large church and had dwindled down. And it was an odd situation, because it was one of those situations where I get this phone call and it's, "Hey Jim, this is Jason," introduced himself to me. He said, "I was given your name as a reference. We're looking for a preacher. Would you be interested to come interview with us?" And I'm like, "I don't have been lane for about 6 months." And it's like, yeah, no. No, I'm just starting something new. I'm not looking for another place to go. But ends up, he becomes the minister of the church. And they switch up how they're doing ministry. And it goes from around 100 people down to about 50 people. So, they're really struggling. But then people start coming in. New people start coming in. And one day, and he's telling me this a couple of years after the fact, the whole story, he kind of mentioned it along the way. But they had a few prostitutes start coming to church. And it was obvious that they were prostitutes. And there was 1 or 2 of them. And then there were 5 of them. And then there were 10 of them. And a couple of the families in the church were upset with this fact. And he was approached as, "We don't want those kind of people here." And his response was, "What in the heck is wrong with you?" And that group ended up leaving the church. We call it a blessed subtraction. Because if anybody needs to be there, it's them. And you're able to help them, not only spiritually, but also in the grand scheme of things. Here's the crazy part of it. In the last 6 or 7 years, this church has averaged 100 baptisms a year. There's some craziness for you. Who belongs and who doesn't? People from the wrong side of the tracks. Because he told me, one day he called me and he was, really discouraged. He's like, "Dude, we had 35 at church on Sunday. And now they're running, 450, 500 or more. That's church. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? All right, well, we're going to wrap it up there. Great questions. Man, I actually like the mornings where we don't even have to look at the sheet all that